Mosaic, a daily news program from WorldLink TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome to the news brief from Abu Dhabi Television. 4 American soldiers were killed in Khost region during confrontations between U.S. troops and Afghan troops belonging to the separatist leader Bachkan Zadran. Bush still insists on a new UN resolution on Iraq, and debate over the resolution continues until next week. Powell says that options regarding a new resolution on Iraq are still open, including not voting on the resolution. Paris is prepared to move forward towards a resolution into the Iraqi crisis and rejects the British proposal. London denounces the French position and says that Resolution 1441 is enough to wage war on Iraq. Now to our correspondent in London, Kamal Elwani.
British Foreign Minister Jack Straw expresses his surprise to French statements regarding the use of their veto power. He also affirms that Resolution 1441 may allow the use of force against Iraq.
The U.S. is putting pressure on Turkey to form a new government, and Ankara announces that it will make a decision that is suitable with its national interests. Now to our correspondent in Ankara, Mohammed Al-Abbasi.
Turkish Defense Minister is hinting that they will participate in the war, while the deputy of the United States Ground Forces commander is examining the ports of Iskenderun and Mersin. Meanwhile, the American ambassador is pressuring Erdogan to immediately form his new government. However, the opposition within Turkey's Justice Party insists on their position, which rejects war.
4 Palestinians were martyred near Jenin, and Israel arrests 12 activists in the West Bank. Israel also sends huge military reinforcements to Hebron and continues to demolish homes in Bethlehem and Tul Karam. This is the end of the news in brief.
Welcome to the news from Abu Dhabi Television. French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin stated during a news conference that the British proposal on Iraq is considered a call for war, adding that this is unacceptable and that France will never accept this proposal since it calls for the spontaneous use of force against Iraq. De Villepin also said that the British proposal does not serve the international community's demands, noting that inspections have brought about results. Thus, the inspections must continue in accordance with the UN Resolution 1441. Meanwhile, British Foreign Minister Jack Straw declared that the French decision to reject the British proposal is a mistake. He said that the 6 conditions recently proposed by London are but a summary of what was contained in Hans Blix's report. The British minister added that in any case, Paris will vote against any new proposal. In new developments, today Iraq announced that it will release a new report on its VX gas the day after tomorrow, and another report on anthrax to be released in a few days. A U.S. military spokeswoman declared that in preparation for the war against Iraq, B-2 bombers departed from a Missouri air base. And the spokeswoman, who did not name the destination of the plane, said that it was the first time that the United States military has deployed this model of airplane in preparation for war against Iraq. The Pentagon stated that the number of U.S. soldiers in the Persian Gulf exceeded 250,000. More than half of them are currently in Kuwait.
The number of troops stationed in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf are increasing, indicating that a war against Iraq is near. According to Pentagon estimates, the number of U.S. soldiers in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East exceed 250,000. U.S. forces are now deployed in several areas. For example, in Kuwait, there are at least 140,000 soldiers. In other Arabian Gulf countries, there are more than 22,000 soldiers, among whom 9,000 are in Saudi Arabia, and approximately the same in Qatar. Another 50,000 soldiers are aboard aircraft carriers and warships in the Persian waters. On board U.S. naval ships in the Mediterranean Sea are about 20,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, 5,000 soldiers currently are in Turkey, and the numbers are increasing. In addition to these numbers, there are 15,000 soldiers in Afghanistan and other Central Asian countries. But most likely, they will not participate in this war. However, their presence brings up the total of American soldiers to approximately 170,000. The increased military presence is accompanied with daily land, air, and sea exercises.
We're very ready.
We are very ready, and everyone has had the opportunity to settle and to be familiar with the area.
The ongoing preparations for a war in Iraq have now led to a feeling of relaxation. According to analysts, the military strengths are not balanced, but this does not mean that the American soldiers are on vacation. While they are waiting for the decisive moment, the soldiers are enjoying food, resting in the spring sun, and engaging in different hobbies.
This will be the first time in 8 months.
This will be the first time in 8 months. I forgot how to swim. Luckily, I didn't drown.
These celebrations are being held on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, stationed in Persian waters, as if it is a victory party to a war which hasn't started yet.
The United States said on Thursday it might abandon its search for a UN Security Council majority to authorize a looming invasion of Iraq as its diplomatic efforts suffered new setbacks, still lacking Security Council support for a resolution that would give Iraq a few more days to satisfy its disarmament demands. The White House said diplomatic efforts could spill over into next week. But U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell said Washington could also pull the resolution co-sponsored by Britain and Spain and wage war under the authority of previous UN votes. With over 250,000 American and British troops poised to invade Iraq, U.S. President George W. Bush maintains he will launch a war without UN backing if necessary. He added to the U.S. firepower on Thursday, sending B-2 stealth bombers to the region. Iraq's Foreign Minister Naji Sabri rejected on Thursday as an aggressive plan for war the British proposals for the revised draft UN resolution, setting a string of disarmament tasks for Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Sabri said the proposals sought to personalize the rift between Iraq and the US and Britain by demanding disarmament moves from Saddam directly. Britain listed a series of demands on Wednesday in what was seen as an effort to seek a way out of the impasse at a bitterly divided Security Council over a draft resolution authorizing the use of force to disarm Iraq. Among 6 new British demands attached to the draft is one that Saddam declared on television that he would give up hidden weapons of mass destruction.
To United Nations Charter, to all Security Council resolutions, and to the will of all nations around the world.
Meanwhile, France, Germany and Russia on Thursday flatly rejected the British proposal aimed at breaking the deadlock over the UN Security Council resolution, reducing the chances of Washington getting UN backing for a war. French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin said Britain's idea of setting Baghdad specified tests of compliance with UN weapons inspectors was unacceptable, as it was still based on the idea of getting a deadline for military action. Villepin added that Paris rejected the logic of ultimatums. Russian counterpart Igor Ivanov reiterated that Russia would vote against any UN resolution opening the way for military strikes, indicating that London and Washington were far from swaying a French, German, Russian front against war. German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and his advisor on foreign and security policy said while Germany was not against specific disarmament demands, it could not back Britain's idea of compliance tests as they still implied authorization for war. Guinea, which chairs the UN Security Council this month, may abstain from voting on the new resolution. As Radio Guinea International said, Guinea may opt for abstention, though the United States has already made it clear that an abstention would be tantamount to voting against the resolution. Guinea is one of the Council's swing votes in the tug-of-war between the US and France over the resolution dismissed by Iraq as a dressed-up plan for war and rejected out of hand by 2 permanent members of the Council holding veto rights. A resolution requires 9 votes from the 15-member Council. Britain's Queen Elizabeth has postponed an official visit to Belgium next week amid mounting preparation for the US-led war on Iraq. British Prime Minister Tony Blair's official spokesman said the Queen had cancelled her visit on government advice, but insisted it was not an indication that an attack would be launched next week. The Queen had been due to visit Brussels for 2 days at the invitation of Belgium's King Albert. Belgium recently joined France and Germany in blocking for several weeks the moves at NATO to reinforce Turkey's defenses in anticipation of a possible conflict. Jailed Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan on Thursday warned that war in Iraq could spark a century of fighting between Turks and Kurds unless all sides avoid narrow nationalist policies. The prospect of a US-led war in northern Iraq has exposed a deep legacy of mistrust and resentment between the Turkish and the Kurdish groups that run neighboring northern Iraq. Turkey has warned the Kurds it is ready to intervene to prevent the establishment of an independent Kurdish state in northern Iraq, while popular Kurdish demonstrations have warned Turkey to stay out. Öcalan, convicted of treason in 1999 for leading a violent Kurdish nationalist uprising and the sole inmate on a Turkish prison island, warned that Kurdish leaders' ardent nationalism carried the risk. The Kurds of northern Iraq have had a measure of independence since the 1991 Gulf War, but they do not have a separate state.
The British Parliament is introducing new demands on Iraq concerning its weapons of mass destruction and denies the American indication that it may not be able to participate in the possible war. This is yet another attempt by British Prime Minister Tony Blair to save face. Blair, who is encountering strong opposition because of his policy towards Iraq, is introducing a list of specific demands from Iraq concerning its weapons of mass destruction, in an attempt to secure the passage of a second international resolution to legitimize the use of force against Iraq. Blair is confirming that British forces will participate in a military operation as long as his country's national interests are served. This comes as a response to Donald Rumsfeld's indication that the US can launch the war single-handed. In any case, the UN Security Council, which is currently holding open meetings on Iraq, has received a new copy of the American and British reforms. Some of the reforms introduced by Washington and London include demanding the Iraqi president to publicly admit to having hidden weapons of mass destruction and to promise to destroy them and allow 30 Iraqi scientists to travel to Cyprus to meet with weapon inspectors. In addition, he is to disclose information on anthrax laboratories and promise to destroy his banned missiles. It appears that Britain and the US are able to overcome their differences that have emerged very recently.
مقترحات تقوم على أنقاض أخرى.
Reforms have emerged from diplomacy, alliances, political pressure, strenuous negotiations, hopes to avoid the war against Iraq, and beliefs that it is inevitable.
ترسم حدود المسألة.
Though these variables continue to shape the Iraqi conflict, they also make it extremely difficult to predict what will happen in the end. In fact, uncertainty about the future of the conflict is increasing because of the new developments in the British and American positions, which, against all odds, are widening. The differences started surfacing when the British administration introduced new reforms to the American resolution, announcing that it is determined to introduce 6 specific conditions on Iraqi President Saddam Hussein to avoid war. These reforms are designed to fit within the framework of the second U.S. resolution, giving Saddam 7 more days until the 24th of March rather than the 17th, which is the original date that was set by the U.S. The British Prime Minister is introducing 6 reforms and the 7 extra days because he is encountering strong domestic opposition. But that seems to be the reason behind the rise of divisions between the American and British positions. American Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is now saying that the U.S. can declare war without Britain. Nonetheless, Blair is trying to reconcile with Washington, confirming that he is determined to stay tough when dealing with Iraq, despite encountering strong domestic opposition, which explains why he announced all his efforts to come up with a new resolution, and urged both France and Russia to reconsider their threats to veto it, because that would jeopardize the unity of the UN. However, his Defense Secretary, Jeff Hone, has been more confident in his support to the United States, declaring that Washington can count on British military support in its war on Iraq, and that the two countries still can launch a war against Iraq under the pretext of Resolution 1441 if the new resolution would not pass. This is supported by Washington, who continues to confirm its intention to go to war with or without international approval. In compliance with that, the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice is warning that time is running out for Saddam Hussein to disarm without war. Nonetheless, international opposition to the American policy has slightly affected her position, which explains why she is now saying that the U.S. is ready to compromise on the second resolution in an attempt to get a majority approval in the UN Security Council. Considering the international opposition and the French position in particular, the Spanish foreign minister is saying that after Palacio went to Paris, he realized that the second resolution on Iraq might be withdrawn because France is determined to vote against it. This comes when the European Union envoy on foreign relations, Chris Paddle, is declaring that a military attack without the support of the UN will damage it greatly and will have grave consequences on NATO and the relationship between the US and Europe. He is also saying that such an attack would make it more difficult for the European Union to offer financial aid after the war is over, and he is casting doubts about the wisdom of imposing democracy by force in Iraq.
Hard to build democracy at the barrel of a gun.
It's hard to build democracy through the barrel of a gun. History confirms that democracy is built through long periods of internal development. If the U.S. occupies Iraq before resolving the Middle East conflicts, most likely the level of terrorism will increase.
Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan is renewing his warning against using military force on Iraq without international approval, and casts doubts on the legitimacy of such action. Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov is saying that launching a war against Iraq will play in the hands of terrorist organizations by giving them an opportunity to destabilize different regions in the world.
Iraq displayed a pilotless plane under investigation by UN weapons inspectors trying to refute U.S. claims that it could be a smoking gun violation of Baghdad's disarmament obligations. Reporters were taken to the Ibn Firnas company north of Baghdad, where Iraqi officials showed a prototype drone of aerial reconnaissance photography and communications jamming. UNMOVIC said last week it had found a previously undeclared drone and was investigating whether it could deliver chemical and biological weapons or fly beyond the 150-kilometer permitted range. At the same time, the destruction of As-Sumud missiles continued. 3 more banned As-Sumud missiles were destroyed as UN weapons inspectors searched at least 9 sites for weapons of mass destruction. Inspectors say Iraq still needs to answer a number of outstanding issues on disarmament, including questions over VX nerve gas and anthrax. Iraqi officials said the destruction of 3 As-Sumud missiles and 2 truckloads of missile parts were proceeding under UN supervision at the Taji military base north of Baghdad. A total of 55 missiles had previously been scrapped along with related components since March 1st. Iraq had an estimated 120 Al-Sumud missiles whose range exceeds UN limits. The UN inspectors went to 9 other sites, including one where Iraq says it destroyed large quantities of anthrax and VX in 1991. And outside the UN Development Program UNDP compound in Baghdad, hundreds of protesters gathered waving Iraqi flags, banners, and portraits of Saddam Hussein. They burnt American and Israeli flags and chanted anti-war slogans. And the diplomatic war between the US and France over Iraq has claimed its first victim: French fries. In an official ceremony, restaurants in the US House of Representatives replaced the words French fries on their menus with freedom fries. And that is just lunch. Breakfast was also dealt a fine blow. Along with pancakes and waffles, one can now also enjoy freedom toast. French toast, freedom toast. The name change has been followed in numerous restaurants across the U.S. in protest of the French opposition to the U.S. administration. One restaurant owner went as far as dumping his cellar of French wine down the drain. The French embassy in Washington had no immediate comment, except to say that French fries actually come from Belgium.
Israeli occupation troops fired with heavy machine gun on a number of citizens in the center of Khalqilia city, leaving 6 citizens injured in critical condition. At Al-Khadr town in Bethlehem, Israeli occupation troops arrested 3 farmers and took them to the occupation forces camp at Kfar Atzion settlement, while Israeli occupation troops raided the Dahi neighborhood south of Nablus city amid heavy firing and arrested citizen Amr Hamami after breaking into a number of houses. In Hebron city, Israeli occupation troops held a large-scale arrest campaign after boosting up its siege on the old town and reinforcing its forces in the town, arresting a number of citizens. At least 1 youth was killed and several others wounded this morning as Israeli occupation troops opened heavy fire on a crowd of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank village of Saida in the district of Tul Karam. These sources added that the raiding Israeli troops barred access of Palestinian paramedics into the shooting-out scene, thus hindering evacuation of injured, that caused the death of 1 civilian and increased the number of casualties among the civilian inhabitants. The source also added that Israeli troops imposed a curfew on the village of Allar. Meanwhile, a Palestinian civilian was wounded earlier today when Israeli occupation soldiers opened heavy fire on Palestinian-owned houses in the southern Gaza Strip city of Rafah. Meanwhile, the citizen Salah Abu al-Ainain, 33 years old, was shot with a live bullet in his foot, Palestinian medical sources said. Dutch Foreign Minister described the continuity of building the Israeli settlement as a very negative act. In a memorandum sent to the Foreign Committee at the Dutch Parliament, the minister criticized the grave situation in the Palestinian territories, as well as the Israeli continuous building of the so-called security wall, which caused severe damage to the Palestinian people and their properties.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, hello and thanks for joining us for this edition of JNN News, coming to you live from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Different corners of the country are hosting mourning ceremonies to honor the memory of the great event of Tasu'ah, when Imam Hussein, the third Imam of Islam's Prophet Muhammad's household, along with 72 of his loyal followers, some 14 centuries ago, gathered in Karbala desert to prepare to fight an historic, unequal battle against tyranny and suppression. On this day, Imam Hussein's brother, Hazrat Abul Fazl Abbas, was amongst the first who bravely fought and achieved martyrdom, precedent to the main event of Ashura. In the capital city of Tehran as well, people took part in mourning ceremonies, one of which was held in the presence of the Islamic Revolution's leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Wednesday night. JNN English News Desk hereby expresses condolences over the tragic event of Tasu'ah to all Muslims in the world, our viewers in particular. The memory of Imam Hussein has been a source of inspiration and liveliness, and the path he paved has been taken by all those seeking justice throughout the history. The remarks were made by Iranian President Mohammad Khatami while addressing a host of mourners gathering at presidential office on Wednesday. Characterizing the Iranian nation's love for Imam Hussein, known as the Lord of the Martyrs, as a source of national solidarity, the president added, such an enthusiastic affection has created strong bonds among the Iranian nation. European Union's Foreign Policy Chief Javier Solana, in a phone contact with Iranian Foreign Minister Kamal Khairazi on Wednesday, pinpointed increasing worldwide opposition against resorting to force to disarm Iraq, as well as that against the U.S. resolution proposed to the UN Security Council. Mr. Solana then asked for constant consultation as well as further views exchange between Iran and European Union to help settle the Iraq standoff. The Iranian foreign minister in turn underscored the necessity of round-the-globe efforts to resort to political channels to disarm Iraq. In a separate development on Wednesday, Iranian foreign minister held a phone conversation with his Greek counterpart, Kyorke Papandreou, who underlined if the U.S. launches its attack on Iraq without the UN permission, the assault will not only grip the Middle East with grave consequences, but also leave an unpleasant background for the United Nations. Iran's UN Permanent Envoy Mohammad Javad Zarif, in his speech at Tuesday's night's session of the UN Security Council, warned of the occurrence of a war in the Persian Gulf region. The Iranian official put emphasis that Iraq should fully cooperate with the UN arms inspectors and that it is the UN Security Council which has the final say. The Iraqi UN representative, also in his words at the UN Security Council, accused the US and Britain of distorting the truth and asked the UN to prevent the occurrence of an imminent war against Iraq. Canadian envoy at the UN Security Council, meanwhile, called for a 3-week deadline to be set for disarming Iraq. Cameroon's UN representative, too, said that the 6 non-permanent members of the Council have set forth the suggestion of a 45-day deadline for Iraq's disarmament. Iran's oil minister, Bijan Namdar Zanganeh, says a U.S. attack on Iraq will send shockwaves through oil markets, shooting up crude prices. Mr. Zanganeh said on Wednesday a recent ministerial meeting of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, has decided to keep crude output unchanged. He further pointed out the OPEC member states will meet in mid-July in an emergency session to review the global supply and demand, stressing at the present time there is no shortage in supply.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support provided by Henry and Virgilia Dakin.